Philip II by William Thomas Walsh. Chapter 9. Philip, Mary and Elizabeth, 1555. Philip thought, and his father agreed, that the English venture had gone as well as could be expected, or better. There were, however, other opinions. The Spanish lords at Hampton Court, where their majesties had lived since summer, were thoroughly disgusted, most of them, with English people and English manners. They deemed the language barbarous, the women plain and badly dressed, the shopkeepers disposed to seek as much profit as possible at the expense of the strangers, the climate vile. In short, they made all the complaints that people commonly make in foreign countries. Perhaps they had expected too much. Willing at first, out of loyalty to Philip, to do everything possible to please the English, they were not without hopes of ruling the country sooner or later. When they discovered, after months of self-control enforced by royal orders, that they were still forbidden to serve their own king in public, and that Mary had no intention of turning over the kingdom to him, they experienced a natural reaction. 4/5 of the 500 who had come to the wedding asked and received permission to cross to Flanders to enlist in the Emperor's wars or to return to Spain. Alba was not sorry to go to the Low Countries on a mission, and thence to Italy as viceroy, April 1555. He and his wife could never be happy in a country where Spanish grandees were not properly valued, where the Lord Admiral felt free to kiss a lady on the mouth. The manners of bluff King Hal were still fashionable in some quarters, and the Spanish, from Philip down, found them abominable. On the other hand, a Spanish infantryman, conscious of belonging to the best army and the most powerful nation in Europe, could be very irritating to a free-born Briton. Street brawls began to occur. Philip handed the offenders over to English justice, as he had threatened. Before he had been in the country 6 months, 2 of his men were hanged, in the stark, unsentimental English manner, for crimes against citizens, one of them for running a man through while 2 other Spaniards held his arms. The Spanish complained that Englishmen who assaulted or cheated them got off scot-free. Philip, however, was adamant. Whatever the English did, no offence must be given by Spaniards. He forbade his men to carry arms. He issued a proclamation to the effect that the first Spaniard to use a weapon should have his hand cut off, and if any one cried "Spain!" even in defence, he was to be hanged. A much worse situation was developing, however, at the turn of the year, and one which gave Philip no small anxiety. The vocal propaganda which usually precedes political action against the Catholic faith was again in motion, especially in London. Lampoons on the Spanish marriage and vile pasquinades on the Queen's pregnancy were published. Preachers, emboldened by Mary's leniency, were beginning to thunder against the Mass and Purgatory and the Scarlet Woman of Babylon. Books as fanatical and treasonable as John Knox's Blast against the Monstrous Regiment of Women were openly circulated in large numbers. A girl named Elizabeth Crofts attempted an impersonation of the Holy Ghost to warn the people against Philip and the Mass. A boy named Featherstone was made to impersonate the dead Edward VI, to cast a doubt on Mary's title. Certain knaves in this country endeavour daily to disturb the peace and quiet and present state of the kingdom, wrote the Venetian ambassador, so as if possible to induce some novelty and insurrection. An Italian who had taught his language to the Princess Elizabeth after Mary released her from the Tower was arrested on suspicion that he was author of a certain dialogue reviling the king and queen and the Catholic religion. The charge could not be proved, and the man was released, while Milady Elizabeth remained under surveillance at Woodstock. All these occurrences seemed to presage a repetition of the attempts against Mary's authority and her life that had ushered in her reign. After a preacher named Ross held a midnight service on the last day of 1554 to pray for the Queen's early death, the council decided to act. Early in January, the extreme English Catholic party in the council decided that the time had come to suppress heresy with a firm hand. Gardiner hesitated, but finally agreed. Even Paget, who was at first opposed, came around to the majority view. On the 22nd, the Chancellor summoned before him 6 of the most notorious of the heretics who were denouncing the Church and the Queen. 2 of them recanted. The other 4 were sentenced to be burned. The first victim was Rogers, who went to the stake on February 4th. Hooper, who had loudly proclaimed that every Catholic priest ought to be drowned, was executed on February 9th at Gloucester. Thus there began in England the persecution that would cost the lives of more than 200 Protestants in the next 4 years, and would be used to justify the slaughter of many thousands of Catholics during the years to come, in England, in Ireland, and elsewhere. Who was to blame for this shocking destruction of human beings who did not share the religious convictions of their rulers? Was it Bloody Mary, as that unhappy woman was henceforth to be known by many generations? Was it Philip, who came from the land of the Spanish Inquisition, where 2,000 secret Jews had been burned under the great Ferdinand and Isabel? Or was it the Catholic Church? 3 loud affirmative replies were promptly framed by Protestant propagandists and cast into concrete, dramatic, and at times highly readable form by John Foxe, whose Acts and Monuments, full of accounts of real and imaginary sufferings of Protestants, would furnish a text for preachers and schoolmasters for centuries to come. It would make no difference to zealots or to the powerful interests they served that many who were burnt under Mary lived to drink sack under Elizabeth, or that persons could point out more than 120 lies on 3 of its pages. Fox's gigantic slander on English Catholics and their church would be chained in hundreds of meeting houses. Long after the best historians had repudiated its bigoted errors, it would continue to cry out against the Church Catholic. Puritans would yet slay women in Ireland, bidding them remember Bloody Mary. Communists of the 20th century would scream the names of Philip and the Inquisition at the nuns they were about to violate and butcher in Barcelona. A Protestant's indignation over the burning of Protestants is easily understandable and is undoubtedly shared today by most Catholics. But if ever there was a persecution that deserved to be called political rather than religious in essence, it was this one. It is of no slight interest to the student of human nature to notice that of all the persons involved on the side of the state, the most innocent, in fact, were those most vilified in the Protestant tradition, Philip and Mary, and the responsible ministers of the Catholic Church. Philip was utterly opposed to religious persecution. He shared the emperor's opinion at this period that no heretic should be punished as such for his religious beliefs. If he had committed acts of treason or had otherwise disturbed the order of the state, let him be tried, and, if found guilty, punished as a traitor. Charles had employed this policy in Germany, and it seemed to him with all the success that could be expected. The inactivity of the Inquisition during his reign, both in Spain and the Netherlands, was notorious. In England, there was even more reason to avoid making religious martyrs. The same ends could be achieved without so doing. Many of the Protestants burned under Mary for heresy would have been punished in the ordinary course, under the rather harsh laws of the kingdom, for murder, for breach of peace, for high treason, or some other criminal offence. Most of them were engaged in subversive activity, which would have been construed as treasonable under any government of the period. Philip, indeed, urged these considerations strongly upon Mary and the council. To make his own position clear, he had his confessor, Fray Alonso de Castro, preach publicly against the persecution on the very day after the burning of Hooper, and with such good effect that a court order suspended further executions for several weeks. Prescott's supposition that Fray Alonso acted on his own initiative, perhaps even in opposition to the king's wishes, is naive, considering that Philip continued to employ this man as confessor and general factotum, and later offered him a bishopric. Major Hume is nearer the truth when he says that, for nearly 6 months Philip's efforts stayed the storm of persecution, and his active intercession saved many condemned to the stake. Not only were Philip and the Spanish priests all against the persecution of the Protestants, but Cardinal Pole, the Pope's legate and primate of all England, would not permit anyone to be burned for heresy in his diocese. If anyone in England could be said to represent the official attitude of the Catholic Church towards the whole business, it was Pole. As for Mary, she seems to have sided with the English Catholics of her council rather than with her husband in this instance, but there is no evidence of the fierce bigotry of which Green, among other English historians, accuses her. The autograph letter she sent her councillors while they were debating the enforcement of the heresy laws is far from being either fierce or bigoted. Touching punishment of heretics, she wrote, "Methinketh it ought to be done without rashness, not leaving in the meanwhile to do justice to such as by learning would seem to deceive the simple, and the rest so to be used, that the people might well perceive them not to be condemned without just occasion, whereby they shall both understand the truth and beware to do the like, and especially within London I would wish none to be burnt without some of the council's presence, and both there and everywhere good sermons at the same." Mary approved of the persecution because it seemed to her by far the lesser of two evils. The peace and order of her kingdom were menaced. The lives of thousands seemed more important than the lives of a few disturbers. The real truth about these martyrs, wrote the Protestant historian Cobbett, is that they were generally a set of most wicked wretches who sought to destroy the Queen and her government, and under the presence of conscience and superior piety to obtain the means of again preying upon the people. No mild means could reclaim them. Those means had been tried. The Queen had to employ vigorous means, or to suffer her people to continue to be torn by the religious factions, created not by her, but by her two immediate predecessors, who had been aided and abetted by many of those who now were punished, and who were worthy of 10,000 deaths each, if 10,000 deaths could have been endured. They were, without a single exception, apostates, perjurers, or plunderers, and the greater part of them had also been guilty of flagrant high treason against Mary herself, who had spared their lives, but whose lenity they had requited by every effort without their power to offset her authority and government. To make particular mention of all the ruffians that perished upon this occasion would be a task as irksome as it would be useless, but there were among them 3 of Cranmer's bishops and himself. For now justice at last overtook this most mischievous of all villains, who had justly to go to the same stake that he had unjustly caused so many others to be tied to. The 3 others were Hooper, Latimer, and Ridley, each of whom was indeed inferior in villainy to Cranmer, but to few other men that have ever existed. If there is some exaggeration in this, there seems to many a beautiful poetic justice in the death of Cranmer, who had so cold-bloodedly caused to be burned large numbers not only of Catholics, but of Protestant dissenters from the Church of England. The method of execution, so abhorrent to the modern imagination, has been attributed to the influence of Spain and its Inquisition. The truth is that even this was a domestic and not an imported custom. The medieval English apparently thought burning more merciful than hanging, and small wonder, considering what death on the gallows implied for a traitor, the ripping out of his entrails while he still breathed and suffered, the hacking off of his arms and legs, and other indignities. This was the death ordained for a man convicted of treason. For the same offence a woman was burned. In the light of English jurisprudence, then, Cranmer and his fellows were being let off with a woman's punishment, in comparison to that of monks and gentlemen who were hanged alive, disembowelled, castrated, and quartered under Henry and Edward. The whole Marian persecution, in short, must be considered an English, not a Spanish affair. The English people were generally for it. Perhaps it was natural that, after enduring so much bloody injustice from a small, wealthy, and organised minority in the last 2 reigns, they now welcomed the chance to turn upon the oppressors and give them a taste of their own medicine. It was an English council that decided upon the policy. The whole Parliament approved of it. It surely must have had the support of public opinion to keep it in force during the whole of Mary's reign, for she was notoriously lacking in money and other material resources that her enemies commanded, yet they dared not oppose her openly, because the people were with her. It is an interesting question whether, if she had had the full support of Phillip and the Emperor and Cardinal Pole, she would not have established a solid and permanent unity in England, as her grandmother Isabel had done by uncompromising measures in Spain. Philip still hoped to win over the English by kindness, and spared no pains to do so. On March 26, 1555, he ran so many courses in a tournament that the Queen was alarmed and sent to ask him not to risk his life further, since he had already done his full duty. In April he took Mary to Hampton Court to await her confinement. Did he have any suspicion that she was not really pregnant, but was already victim of a disease that cruelly flattered her passionate desire for a child? Others knew it not long after this, and the astute and watchful Philip was not likely to be the last. The moment was critical for him. Everything depended upon his having a child, preferably a son. Granted an heir, and with ordinary perseverance and good fortune, success seemed almost certain. His enemies would have no legitimate royalty around which to rally opinion against him. The next legitimate heir would be Mary Stuart. The Protestant rich would go to her only as a last resort, for she was Catholic and in the French sphere. Elizabeth was their only other hope, a slender one if Mary bore a child. But let it be established that Mary could never have a child, and Elizabeth, bastard though she was, would become a person of tremendous importance. In that case, the influence of Spain and the Empire, added to the overwhelmingly Catholic sentiment in England, could easily throw the succession to Mary Stuart, and thus keep England within the Catholic family of nations, in obedience to the Pope. But it would also mean that France would dominate England, and, sooner or later, the Netherlands. Thus, France would become a great European empire, overshadowing Spain. This, to the Emperor, was an intolerable thought. To avoid the very possibility, he decided upon the desperate alternative of supporting the claim of Elizabeth. Philip, as usual, followed his father's wishes. Neither was aware, perhaps, that such a policy involved the staking of the welfare of Christendom upon a slender chance. French domination would not necessarily mean a Catholic England in the long run. French kings had too often sacrificed the interests of the Church to selfish personal or national interests. It might have been denied, too, that the only alternative to French influence through Mary Stuart would be a Protestant England under Elizabeth. Elizabeth was little more than a girl and could doubtless be handled by the right person. The Emperor apparently thought that Philip was that person. It seemed very simple. Marry her to some good Catholic attached to the imperial house, and she probably would become a Catholic. On Mary's succession, she had professed, with tears, that she saw the errors of what she had been taught to believe and wished to return to the Catholic faith of her fathers. She had gone to Mass with her sister, opened a chapel in her own house, and sent to France for a chalice, cross, and vestments. Reynard doubted the sincerity of her conversion, and the Wyatt rebellion had confirmed his suspicions. But Mary induced the Queen to release her from the Tower and keep her at Woodstock. She was only a girl, he argued, and had been deceived by others. Mary still feared and distrusted her half-sister. At one time she thought of sending her to a convent in Spain, at another of placing her under the tutelage of Philip's aunt, Mary, Queen of Hungary. Philip again urged her against any such action until their son was born, lest the opposition have a chance to say that the heirs to the throne were being sent out of the kingdom. Besides, he had a better plan, the plan of marrying Elizabeth to his friend, the Duke of Savoy, and he had Philibert Emmanuel come to England for the purpose in the last days of 1554. The plan might have succeeded if the French ambassador had not got wind of it and advised Elizabeth not even to see the Duke. It was probably at Philip's suggestion that Mary was sent for her sister to come to Hampton Court on April 17th, 1555. Elizabeth arrived on the 29th, still under the guard of Sir Henry Bedingford, and was lodged in the apartment just vacated by the Duke of Alba, next to that of Philip. She was strictly guarded and was not allowed to see the Queen. It was Philip and not Mary who went to visit her 2 or 3 days later, though the Queen sent her word to array herself richly for the King's coming, if we may believe the French accounts. It was Philip's first meeting with Elizabeth, a momentous one. What did the King of 28, married to a fading and sickly woman of almost 40, think of the girl of 20, whom he had already saved from exile and perhaps from death? Elizabeth was tall and stately, and at that time had a great deal of the mysterious attraction her mother had had for certain men. Fortunately, she had escaped some of Anne Boleyn's abnormalities, the 6th finger, for example, and the goiter at the neck which had brought high ruffed collars into fashion. Nevertheless, there was a great deal of the famous concubine in her, a great deal of the same energy and charm, the same long face, the same hint of courage and insatiable vanity, qualities that showed especially in a mouth as yet marked by bitterness in unguarded moments only, and apt for lies or kisses that could make men forget the coldness of her green and hazel eyes, and the remote suggestion of something like death in the mask-like marble of the upper face. Elizabeth was probably far more attractive and certainly more majestic in her bearing than Mary. It was not difficult for one who knew her history to have a great deal of sympathy for her. She resembled Mary only in that deep, mannish Tudor voice and in her reddish-brown hair. Yet her life had been even more wretched. She had been introduced to misery and neglect almost from her cradle. As if it were not bad enough to be born out of wedlock to a syphilitic brute and a mother whom he had sent to the block a year later for adultery and incest, accusations that Elizabeth never attempted to disprove when she became queen, imagine the feelings of a little girl cast off by this same father and proclaimed a bastard by Act of Parliament, seldom visited by her royal progenitor, and not even provided with decent clothes. She hath neither gown, nor kirtle, nor petticoat, wrote her guardian, Lady Margaret Bryan Cromwell, nor no manner of linen for smocks, nor kerchiefs, nor sleeves, nor rails, nor body stitchets, nor handkerchiefs, nor mufflers, nor biggins. Her great teeth came very slowly forth, and caused her great pain, and yet, according to Lady Bryan, she was a gentle, agreeable child. She was precociously intelligent, read a great deal, became proficient in Latin and Greek, and was introduced to Christianity by Protestant preachers of various factions of a new religion that was already changing rapidly. If her logical mind came to profess a certain contempt for religion in general, it was probably for this reason, and not because she was naturally indifferent. On the contrary, she went to great pains at the age of 12 to translate the pious, if unorthodox, Miroir de l'âme pécheresse, with which Marguerite of Angoulême, in whose corrupt court Anne Boleyn spent much time in her youth, perhaps quieted any scruples she felt over the pagan impurities of her Heptameron. A godly meditation of the Christian soul concerning a love towards God and his Christ, compiled in French by Lady Margaret, Queen of Navarre, and aptly translated into English by the right virtuous Lady Elizabeth, daughter of our late sovereign, King Henry VIII. She herself acknowledged that the translation was all imperfect and incorrect, but it bears witness, at least, of a normal sense of reverence. It was Philip's idea, and one not without evidence to support it, that Elizabeth, God knows by what means, cherished in her heart a conviction that the Catholic Church was the only true form of Christianity. Her father had once demonstrated this fact, and died believing himself a Catholic. It is inconceivable he could have been anything else if passion and self-interest had not prevailed over conviction. The same was true, Philip thought, of Elizabeth. She had said so. It was remarkable that, surrounded by Calvinists, as she had been since babyhood, she clung all her life to a belief in the celibacy of the clergy, and even went so far, years later, as to insult the wife of Archbishop Parker, her own creature, as a rebuke to clerical marriage. Concerning the cross, the Blessed Virgin, and the saints, she had no contemptuary opinion, wrote Camden, nor even spoke of them but with reverence, nor suffered others patiently to speak unreverently of them. In 1559 she told the Count of Ferrier there were only 3 or 4 things she objected to in the Mass, and she believed that God was in the sacrament of the Eucharist. Perhaps she was dissimulating then, but in her childhood, surely, she would have become as staunch a Catholic as Mary if she had had a Catherine of Aragon at hand to protect her from the tales of Catherine Howard's adulteries and the coarse jests of Henry about Anne of Cleves, and from corruption at 13 by the Protector Somerset, whose wife found them in each other's arms. The 7 years since then had probably developed in her that strong sexual craving which was to torment her all her life, and which apparently because of some physical abnormality could never be satisfied. She was therefore unfit for marriage. This was the decisive factor then in the whole situation, and one of which the Emperor and Philip knew nothing. While Elizabeth was meekly going to Mass with the Queen, the imperial politicians were erecting a future for all Christendom on the foundation of a marriage which could never take place. Whether Philip at this first meeting gave his sister Elizabeth any intimation that he would support her claim to succeed Mary, in case his own hopes of an heir were disappointed, will probably never be known. Neither of the discreet principals left any record of the conversation. It is safe to say, however, that he was gracious and reassuring, the Emperor's son offering his powerful protection to the girl in disgrace, and that Elizabeth, perhaps playing with her rings, as she often did, to call attention to her beautiful white hands, added nothing very definite to that cryptic record she had carved with a diamond on a pane of glass at Woodstock. Much suspected by me, nothing proved can be, quoth Elizabeth, prisoner. This visit of Philip's was the opening of a small but valuable door for outcast Elizabeth. 2 weeks later, probably through his aid, she was allowed to see her great-uncle, Lord William Howard, and through him to obtain an interview with some of the Privy Council, Gardiner, Arundel, Shrewsbury, and Petre, who went to see her. The Chancellor knelt before her and requested that she would submit herself to the Queen's grace. In so doing, he had no doubt but that Her Majesty would be good to her. Elizabeth replied with a haughty denial of any guilt on her part. "And therefore I say, my lords, it were better for me to lie in prison for the truth than to be abroad and suspected of my prince." This was play acting, in which Elizabeth excelled. At the same time, she was writing to various friends, asking them to use their influence to get her freed. Gardiner made a second attempt to reconcile the sisters, but with no better success. Someone, however, was it Philip, interceded with Mary so effectively that a week later the young princess was summoned at 10 o'clock at night and led up a dark stairway by torchlight to the Queen's bedchamber. "It is thought that Philip was there behind a cloth and not seen," adds Fox, the contemporary but not very reliable chronicler, "and that he showed himself a very friend in that matter. If this be true, the young king must have witnessed a memorable scene from behind the arras, Elizabeth kneeling before Mary, and the two women, daughters of bitter enemies and rivals for a throne, regarding each other in the soft candlelight." Fox reports the conversation thus: "Her Grace kneeled down and desired God to preserve Her Majesty, not mistrusting that she should try herself as true a subject towards Her Majesty as ever did any, and desired Her Majesty even so to judge of her, and said that she should not find her to the contrary, whatsoever report otherwise had gone of her. To whom the Queen answered, You will not confess your offence, but stand stoutly in your truth. I pray God it may so fall out. If it doth not, quoth the Lady Elizabeth, I request neither favour nor pardon at your Majesty's hands." "Well," said the Queen, "you stiffly still persevere in your truth. Belike you will not confess but that you have been wrongfully punished." "I must not say so, if it please your Majesty, to you." "Why then," said the Queen, "belike you will to others." "No, if it please your Majesty," quoth she, "I have borne the burden, and must bear it. I humbly beseech your Majesty to have a good opinion of me, and to think me to be your true subject, not only from the beginning hitherto, but for ever, as long as life lasteth." And so they departed, with very few comfortable words of the Queen in English, but what she said in Spanish, God knoweth. Philip knew also. A week later Elizabeth was set free. The event passed almost unnoticed, but it was highly important, not only to Elizabeth but to all mankind. The history of the world would henceforth be different. The course of Philip's domestic affairs seemed to justify the pains he had taken to make an ally of the Lady Elizabeth. Mary's physicians had at last decided that the swelling of her body was pathological, but at first they could not convince her of the fact. Were not the cradles and swaddling clothes of the baby all ready, and even toys provided? Had not public prayers been offered throughout the realm for her safe delivery? Had not the Parliament petitioned Philip to rule during the minority of the heir, should it happen to the Queen otherwise than well? Were not the joyful letters of announcement ready to be sent to the far corners of the earth, with blank spaces for the date and the child's sex to be filled in? It was not easy for a woman to believe that she was already standing in the shadow of death, and then to admit that it was all illusion. There is a little prayer book of Mary's in the British Museum that still speaks eloquently of what this renunciation must have cost her. It opens of itself at a page much thumbed and stained yellow with tears, a page containing two prayers, one for the unity of the Catholic Church, the other for the safe delivery of a woman with child. After some tears and prayers, the Queen accepted the situation as the will of God. Philip took her to Oatlands, while Hampton Court was being cleansed of the filth that had accumulated for years in the straw covering its floors. When they returned in August, no trace remained of her disappointment. "The Queen shows herself," reported Michael to the Doge, "and converses with everybody as usual, her health being so good as perhaps never to have been better, to the universal surprise of all who see her, but of delivery of pregnancy small signs are visible externally, and no one talks or thinks of them any longer." Had Philip suspected what the result would be, Cabrera de Cordoba says flatly that Mary had only pretended to be pregnant to keep the English in hand until Philip won their love and obedience. This cynical Spanish judgment is not supported by English accounts, useful though it might be to explain Philip's precautions in regard to Elizabeth. He had already decided to leave England in September. The Emperor warned by ill health of his approaching end, had decided to abdicate and retire to a monastery. It was necessary, therefore, that Philip go to Brussels to be invested with the sovereignty of Spain and of the Low Countries, while the imperial crown passed to Ferdinand. As early as August 18th, the observant Michiel wrote to Venice that Philip was making precautions for the voyage, having already adroitly broached the topic to the Queen, who will acquiesce, so it is said he will leave in 8 or 10 days, postwise, leaving the greater part of his household, for the sake of convincing the Queen by as many signs as he can, that he purposes returning speedily, though on the contrary it is said more than ever that he will go to Spain, and remove hence his household and all the others by degrees. Their Majesties went to London on the 26th, and thence after dinner to Greenwich, there to wait for the fleet. His Majesty, wrote Michiel, had determined, when passing through London, to show himself in public to the people on horseback, leaving the Queen to follow him at leisure, by water as usual, but Her Majesty chose to give the city the satisfaction of seeing her likewise in his company, she having made the determination when in the very act of embarking. So, having herself carried in an open litter, she went accompanied not only by the English and Spanish nobility now at court, but also by the cardinal legate and the ambassadors, the Lord Mayor and all the aldermen, with the royal insignia and all the other solemnities, as customary when the Queen appears in public. It is not to be told what a vast crowd of people there was all along the road, which is a very long one, nor yet the joy they demonstrated at seeing their Majesties, which was really great, and the more as the London populace were firmly convinced that the Queen was dead. So when they knew of her appearance, they all ran from one place to another, as to an unexpected sight, and one which was well nigh new, as if they were crazy, to ascertain thoroughly if she was. And on recognising and seeing her in better plight than ever, they, by shouts and salutations, and every other demonstration, then gave yet greater signs of their joy, inasmuch as to their great comfort and that of Her Majesty, they saw her come, with the King on one side of her and Cardinal Pole on the other, both of whom are universally popular, by reason of the reported kindness of their nature, and of which daily proof is afforded by facts, so that the determination to make this display most especially at the present moment has been very useful. Meanwhile Mary was disconsolate, though she conceals it as much as she can, and from what I hear, added Michiel, mourns the more when alone and supposing herself invisible to any of her attendants. After an affectionate farewell to his wife, who suppressed her obvious grief as well as she could, Philip embarked in the first week in September. When Mary had returned to her apartments and had placed herself at a window overlooking the river to see him pass, Philip mounted aloft on the barge in the open air in order to be better seen when the barge approached in sight of the window, and moreover waved his bonnet from the distance to salute her, demonstrating great affection. Now, whilst His Majesty is at Canterbury, not only every day but every hour expresses are on the road from the King to the Queen, and in like manner from hence to His Majesty, the gentlemen in waiting being always booted and spurred ready for a start. Philip did not know that after leaving him and going to the window, not supposing herself any longer seen or observed by anyone, it was perceived that she gave free vent to her grief by a flood of tears, nor did she once quit the window until she had not only seen the King embark and depart, but remained looking after him as long as he was in sight. He sent back many loving messages from Canterbury, where contrary winds detained him for 5 days, and at last he set sail. It can hardly be supposed that he was sorry to go. All his life so far he had followed obediently in the paths marked out by his father. Now there opened before him the prospect of being himself. England, meanwhile, could get along without him. Mary was no more unfortunate in a way than his mother, the Empress, when Charles had left her for years at a time to fight his wars. Kings and queens had to consider their public duties before their private desires. That was an axiom. Unfortunately, the Lady Elizabeth seemed to be repaying his kindness in the coin he best desired. She was often seen at Mass, and on the very day of Philip's departure, the Queen's Grace and my Lady Elizabeth and all the court did fast from flesh, and took the Pope's Jubilee and pardon granted to all men. With Elizabeth Catholic, all would be well. The unity of Christendom would be preserved, and France would be kept out of England. Just before his departure, Philip had sent for Cardinal Pole and the Lords of the Council, and in very suitable language recommended the government of the kingdom to them during his absence, alluding especially to justice and religion, leaving a writing in which, as I was told by the legate, wrote Michael to the Doge, were noted all such warnings as he deemed most important and necessary, with a detailed list of such persons as could be entrusted and employed for any necessary business or office, a matter which, although discussed previously, surprised everyone by the judgment and tact displayed in it by his Majesty, who then, thus in public, turning towards Cardinal Pole, besought him very earnestly in his own name and that of the Queen to assume this charge in conformity with his own patriotism and the wish of their Majesties, desiring all the others to defer to him in everything. This same office had been performed by the King with the Cardinal the day before, they being alone together, his Majesty for this purpose having gone very privately in person to the legate's own apartment, taking him quite by surprise. 6 weeks after Philip left England, Gardiner, though a dying man, opened Parliament with a most impressive speech. The Queen had herself carried to Westminster in an open horse litter, to be seen of everyone, and heard the Chancellor enumerate the debts she had inherited from her father and her brother, and those she had had to incur herself, with regard to which he did not omit to say that King Philip, whilst in England, had spent much more than her Majesty, who meanwhile had not chosen to avail herself, as she might have done, of the taxes and subsidy conceded by Parliament to her brother King Edward, amounting to upwards of 1,200,000 ducats, but remitted that sum, for the sake of not burdening any other. Neither did she choose, as she might and ought to have done in justice, to avail herself of the revenues and estates of many of her rebels, amounting to a very considerable sum, but to demonstrate thoroughly her benignity and clemency, she made them a free gift, both of their lives and lands. Magnanimity was wasted on men who understood no principles but those of money changers. When the Queen, on November 20th, after the irreparable loss of Gardiner on the 12th, made the enormous sacrifice, as proof of her utter sincerity, of giving up the first fruits and tenths of the Church, wrongfully appropriated by her father, the Parliament raised no great objection. The Lords passed the bill on November 23rd after a speech by the Queen herself on the 19th. They voted her 1,000,000 in gold to be levied in 4 years. The sum was so inadequate that she was soon compelled to pay the City of London 12% for a loan of £20,000. The Queen had a much greater design, which she hoped to have executed by this Parliament, continues the historian of Parliament quaintly, which was getting an act for restoring all such lands to the Church as belonged to it, and was devolved upon the Crown, and from the Crown into the hands of private persons. Certain it is, says Dr. Heylin, that many who were cordially affected to the Queen's religion were very much startled at the noise of this restitution, insomuch that some of them are said to have clapped their hands upon their swords, affirming, not without some oaths, that they would never part with their abbey lands, as long as they were able to wear a sword at their side. Which resolution being told the Queen, she thought proper to drop that affair, and only set them a good example, by giving up to the Church what was really her own to give, the first fruits and tenths aforesaid. It was one thing for the Queen to sacrifice her own share of the Church loot. It was quite another to ask the new nobility to restore theirs. The parliamentary opposition was quiet, but was solid and well organised. Its leader was Sir William Cecil, he of the rattling rosary beads, who knelt with his wife in a Catholic church at Christmas that year to receive the Holy Eucharist, with unbelief and hatred, to judge from his later actions, in his unfathomable heart. He kept himself well in the background, biding his time, in frequent communication with the Lady Elizabeth, but careful to destroy their correspondence. Mary's failure seemed to confirm the practical judgment of the Emperor, but Philip shared in it, for he sent his reluctant consent after leaving England. As it was, however, much was accomplished. The Franciscan and Dominican exiles returned from Flanders and were received with honour by the English. The Franciscan convent was reopened at Greenwich. The Benedictines returned to their monastery at Westminster, the Carthusians to Sheen, the nuns to Sion. The libraries at Oxford and Cambridge were restored to orthodoxy by the labours of the Queen's confessor, a Dominican friar named Bartolome de Carranza, who had come from Spain for the purpose. Meanwhile, to supply the urgent need of priests, Pole established seminaries for boys. His plan was adopted by the Council of Trent a few years later in its decree on seminaries, so beneficial to the modern church. Philip reached Brussels on September 8th. The Emperor, who had been waiting impatiently for him for months, received him at the casino near the Louvain gate, doffed his bonnet, and, when the young king knelt to kiss his hand, begged him earnestly to rise. In getting up, Philip kissed his father's left arm. The emperor embraced and kissed him so lovingly that tears came into his eyes. Philip then presented his English companions, the Admiral Howard and the rest. A round of festivities followed. On the third day after Philip's arrival, obsequies for the emperor's mother, Joanna the Mad, were held. While the bier was being erected at the church of St. Gudule, Queen Mary of Hungary was arranging for a grand hunt in honour of her nephew. She was still, at 52, an admirable horsewoman, never quiet for a moment, and determined, if possible, not to return to Spain with her brother, but to remain as ruler of the Netherlands. One of the Venetian ambassadors was cynical enough to see in this the real motive for her writing Mary Tudor the following April, to lay aside all timidity and have Philip crowned King of England. Otherwise he would remain in Flanders, which was just what Aunt Maria feared. Philip found his father shockingly altered, repentant one day and angry the next, a shattered column of a great man, at times hardly able to stand. The heartbreaking climax, so often described by poets and preachers, as well as historians, came on the afternoon of Friday, October 25th. Charles himself chose the day after many long conferences with his son, in which all the ramifications of his enormous problems of government were gone into thoroughly for the last time. On the 25th, both arose early, heard Mass, and spent several hours in discussion. At 3 o'clock they went to the great hall of the palace, Charles mounted on a small mule, for he was too weak to sit on a horse, and took their places on the dais, two dark, dramatic figures against the rich cloths of gold and divers royal colours, with the two queens, Eleanor of France and Mary of Hungary, Charles's sisters, and William of Orange, on whose shoulder the emperor leaned as he faced the assembly of nobles, deputies, cavaliers of the Golden Fleece, ambassadors and burghers. It was hugely and ironically symbolical of the emperor's character, of his principal mistakes, and of the Pandora's box of state problems he was preparing to bequeath to his son, that on this final momentous occasion he singled out for an especial mark of favour to his beloved Flemings this particular young Prince of Nassau. Astute, able and garrulous, he was then, at 22, high in the emperor's favour. Now, seemingly a Catholic, he had been a Protestant, and would be again when it suited his purposes. Charles refused to listen to those, including his sister, the Queen of Hungary, who questioned the man's sincerity. Many told him he should curb this man's arrogance, and believed that his astuteness would prove very destructive to his interests. He was fattening a fox that would eat up his chickens, as the proverb goes. But Charles disregarded the prediction and the warning, honoured him further, made him great, sent him with the imperial crown to his brother, and commended him to the king when he went away, saying that he, Philip, should avail himself of his counsel. After the introductory explanation in French by the president of the Council of Flanders, it was William of Orange who helped the emperor to his feet when, with evident difficulty, he arose. There was a profound hush as Charles put on his glasses with trembling hand and fumbled with a little memorandum of what he was to say. Speaking slowly, he began reviewing his life from the day when, in that same place 40 years before, he had been released from his minority. Since then, in the interests of his people, he had exhausted himself with wars and journeys. I have gone 9 times to Germany, 6 to Spain, 7 to Italy, and I have come 10 times here to Flanders. I have travelled, in war and in peace, 4 times to France, twice to England, and twice again to Africa, making in all 40 expeditions, without counting the shorter journeys I have accomplished to visit my different countries. I have journeyed 8 times upon the Mediterranean, 3 times on the ocean, and this will be the 4th, when I return to Spain to find my sepulchre. I have had to bear the burden of many wars, and this, as I can testify, against my will. Never have I undertaken them except under compulsion and with regret. Even today I grieve that I cannot on my departure leave you in peace and quiet. You may easily imagine that I have not undergone all this without feeling the burden and the fatigue. It is easy to judge of these by the condition to which I am reduced. I have done what I could, and am sorry I could not do better. I have always known my insufficiency and my incapacity. And feeling this to have increased in my present state, I have obliged to adopt this resolution which has been communicated to you. The obstacles to it, moreover, no longer exist. The Queen, my mother, is dead. My son has arrived at man's estate. I trust that God will grant him the talents and the strength to fulfil, better than I have done, the obligations imposed upon a king. I beg you not to read into this resignation any thought of withdrawing myself from the eventualities of trouble, danger, and toil. Believe me, I have no other motive than the inconvenience attached to my powerless and crippled condition. I leave my son in my place, and commend him to you. Render to him the love and obedience which you have already shown towards me. Preserve zealously that union among yourselves that you have never abandoned. Sustain and maintain justice. Above all, do not permit the heresies which surround you to penetrate these lands, and if any such there are, let them be rooted out. I know well that in my day I have committed many faults, as much from youth as from ignorance and carelessness or other causes, but I can say truly that I have never done violence, wrong, or injustice wittingly to any of my subjects. If I have done any, it has been not with my knowledge, but in ignorance, and I am sorry for it and ask pardon for it." By this time there was not a dry eye in the whole great assembly. Charles himself was weeping, and so was Philip. Even the English money changer, Sir Thomas Gresham, who made it his business to be on hand for most important occasions, appears to have shed a few cautious tears. He has left a quaint description of Charles in the moment of his self-abasement. "And here he broke into a weeping, whereunto, besides the dolefulness of the matter, I think he was much provoked by seeing the whole company to do the like before, being, in mine opinion, not one man on the whole assembly, stranger or other, that during the time of a good piece of his oration, poured not abundantly tears, some more, some less." Sir Thomas's sense of measurement never wholly deserted him. Then, turning to Philip, the emperor continued, in a voice half choked with sobs, "My son, always honour religion. Keep the Catholic faith in all its purity. Respect the laws of the country as sacred and inviolable, and never attempt to trespass on the rights and privileges of your subjects. And if you desire at any time, as time goes, to seek as I do the repose of private life, may you have a son to whom you may deliver the sceptre with as much joy as I give mine to you." Philip threw himself on his knees and covered the old man's hand with kisses and tears. When at last he was able to control his feelings, he arose and said, "You lay a heavy charge upon me, yet in obedience to your majesty, as ever, I will continue to conform to your wishes by accepting the rule of these countries. I pray you to aid them and take them under your protection." Then, turning to the assembly, he went on in French. "I should like very much to have learned to speak French sufficiently to be able to express to the estates and to the people all the interest I take in them and all the love I have for them. But since it is not possible for me to do so in French, and even less in Flemish, the Bishop of Arras, who knows my sentiments, will do so in my place. Please hear him as you would hear me." Granvelle, in his polished and eloquent French, explained the desire of the new monarch to serve the country and maintain its liberties as the emperor had. The meeting ended with a few modest words by Queen Mary, who after 25 years as governor planned to retire with her brother. Thus there fell upon the shoulders of Philip, in his 29th year, one of the heaviest burdens that any mortal had ever been called upon to bear. True, the imperial title went to Ferdinand, and after him would go to Maximilian, both of them so jealous that he felt obliged to send a messenger to assure them that he wished them well and had no designs upon the empire. But he would still be the most powerful monarch in the world, King of Spain, the Netherlands, and England, virtually master of Italy, lord of such parts of the Western Hemisphere as had been explored, except Brazil, which was Portugal's, and the Philippines, right arm of the Church, Caesar in fact, if not in name. It was not a responsibility that he desired. He told his father that he would not consider taking it except to prolong the emperor's life. If he had consulted his own preference, he would have better pleased to be simply King of Spain and to live nowhere but in his own country, where he understood the people and they understood him, and the stench of heresy was comparatively unknown. All his life he had been accustomed to ask himself, "What is my duty under the present circumstances?" and then to do it without murmur or complaint. In such a spirit this quiet and peace-loving young man now bent to take upon his back the burden of a great part of the world. It was to prove even heavier than he supposed.